A young woman walked into the future and the courthouse closed its ears before she arrived. Welcome to In Chambers with the Reader's Court. I'm your host, Mark Bertrand, and this podcast is where we step inside and expose what power took away from humanity. This is Case 005, The Scholarship. And the first thing to understand is this. The university did not act alone. Power never does. Behind the scholarship office, behind the compliance agreement, behind the revised funding guidelines, there's a larger machine. Big money, higher education, bond markets, donors, trustees, lobbyists, legislators, judges. All of them standing around the same protected table. All of them pretending the family is the only party who should have read the fine print. That is the scandal beneath the case, not the bill. The bill is only the paper wound. The real wound is that when Sarah's family walks towards the law has already been purchased away from them. Because the courtroom will not let this case be heard as a moral injury. That's the trick. That is the corruption. The family wants to say our daughter was promised a future. The court says limit your argument to enforceable language. The family wants to say her father worked overtime because the family was already drowning in medical debt. The court says income is income. The family wants to say the university waited until she belonged there before moving the cost back onto us. The court says relevance. The family wants to say this is cruel. The court says objection sustained. That is how paid-off justice works. Not always with the bag of cash slid underneath the desk. That is the cartoon corruption, and power is not that stupid anymore. Real corruption wears a robe. Real corruption cites precedent. Real corruption says the human facts are prejudicial. Real corruption narrows the argument until the only thing left alive is the institution's paperwork. That is what captured judges do for the wealthy. They do not need to announce that they serve big money. They simply decide what counts. They decide that the contract counts, but the mother's panic does not. They decide that the signed agreement counts, but the father's exhaustion does not. They decide that institutional policy counts, but the student's reliance does not. They decide that the financial thresholds count, but medical debt does not. They decide that the procedure counts, but decency does not. And once they decide that, the powerful have already won. Before the testimony, before the evidence, before the ordinary person gets to tell the truth in plain language. This is why the courtroom is not neutral. A captured courtroom is a laundering room. It takes human suffering in one door and sends out legal cleanliness through the other. A family enters with betrayal. The judge converts it into a contract interpretation. A girl enters with a future taken from her. The judge converts it into administrative discretion. A father enters with the humiliation of having his sacrifice used against his child. The judge converts it into a household income calculation, and by the time the court is finished, nobody's allowed to talk about the actual happenings. That's the purpose. The gag is the point. The power does not merely want to win this case. Power wants to control what the case is allowed to be about. Because if Sarah's family is allowed to speak in human terms, the university looks monstrous. If the father's overtime is understood as sacrifice, the calculation becomes obscene. If the promise is heard the way ordinary people hear promises, the school becomes a predator. So the court protects the institution by changing the subject. Not what promised, what was written. Not what was understood, what was reserved. Not what was done to the family, but what the policy was allowed to do. That is not justice. That is wealth protection with a seal on it. And this is where judges and politicians enter the story, because these rules are not falling from the sky. Somebody's built a legal world where institutions can advertise certainty and reserve escape. Somebody narrowed consumer protection, somebody weakened ordinary reliance, somebody honored arbitration clauses, somebody elevated fine print over lived experience and meaning. Somebody taught courts to distrust emotions when emotions is often the only honest evidence left. And somebody made sure the family's grief, panic, exhaustion, and humiliation would sound too messy for the law. That somebody was not Sarah Kim. That somebody was not her father. That somebody was not her mother. It was big money, sitting behind the education, sitting behind the campaign finance, sitting behind judicial appointments, sitting behind lobbyists, sitting behind the respectable lie that the system is only applying neutral rules. Neutral rules. That's the oldest mask power owns. There is nothing neutral about a rule written by the side with lawyers, defended by the side with money, interpreted by judges raised inside the same donor-fed legal culture, and enforced against a family opening mail at a kitchen table. There is nothing neutral about telling a teenager that her signature carries more moral weight than the institution's promise. There is nothing neutral about the judge who allows the university to speak in policy language while forbidding the family from speaking in human language. That is what the paid-off bench protects. It protects the wealth from the story because the story is dangerous. The story tells us that Sarah did everything the country tells young people to do. She earned, she obeyed, she performed, she trusted. Her father did everything the country tells men to do. He worked, he paid, he carried the debt, he took the extra shifts, he tried to keep the house standing, and the institution converted all of that virtue into vulnerability. That is the part power cannot let into the courtroom, because once ordinary people hear it, the legal argument becomes morally disgusting. So the judge sanitizes it. The judge says, this is not about fairness. The judge says this is not about emotion. The judge says this is not about what the family believed. The judge says this is about the agreement. And there it is, the pulpit of evil. Not because the judge screams, not because the judge hates the girl, because the judge takes an inhuman result and calls it disciplined reasoning. And that is the danger. A cruel system does not need cruel faces. It needs respectable servants. It needs judges willing to pretend that excluding humanity is intellectual rigor. It needs politicians willing to say schools need flexibility. It needs donors willing to fund opportunity with one hand and protect institutional discretion with the other. It needs universities willing to sell moral language into public and legal escape in private. And it needs families like Sarah's to stand alone, ashamed, confused, broke, wondering why the truth sounds so weak once it enters a courtroom. That weakness is manufactured. That court strips the truth before it lets the truth speak. It removes the father's body from the overtime. It removes the mother's fear from the bill. It removes Sarah's belonging from the promise. It removes the family's reliance from the letter. It removes the human being from the harm. Then it looks at what remains and says, there is no case here. That is not justice failing. That is justice doing what wealth has paid it to do. That is the case beneath the case. The family is not merely betrayed by the university. They were betrayed by a legal order built to make that betrayal survivable for the powerful. Big money does not need to win every heart. It only needs to own the rules of admissibility. It only needs to decide what cannot be said. It only needs a judge willing to look at a stolen future and ask whether the paperwork is in order. That is how humanity gets gagged. That is how corruption protects itself. That is how a promise becomes a policy. And that is how a daughter becomes a balance due. And that is how a courthouse becomes the final office at the institution that harmed her. A young woman walked into the future, and the courthouse closed its ears before she arrived. The stories are fiction. The systems are real. You can read the whole case and file your verdict at markbertrand.substack.com. And as always, the Reader's Court asks one question. What is the right thing to do?